Nightmare in Paris. I think this story made it into a compilation from unit number 522, so I apologize if it's a repeat and won't be upset if you don't use it. I am a 34-year-old female, but this event took place when I was 21 and studying abroad in Europe. I was based out of Italy, but I convinced my parents to let me backpack for a few weeks by myself to other major destinations. To prepare, I read a few books and articles about traveling safely alone and watched Taken right before I left, just for good measure. Okay, so here is the evening I remember like it was yesterday. I was by myself in Paris, having dinner near the Opera House. As I got up from dinner, I noticed a group of 6 men that got up near me and started off in the same direction as me. This wasn't of concern until I noticed that the 6 men who followed less than 20 feet behind me took the same turns and matched my walking speed. They all spoke with an Eastern European accent and dialect that sounded similar to my limited exposure to Russian. After about 10 minutes, they were aware that I noticed them and proceeded to attempt to engage me in conversation with catcalls and general questions, all spoken in English with an Eastern European accent. Starting to get nervous, I decided to pretend like I didn't understand what they were saying. Immediately, they switched to speaking to me in French, which I don't speak at all. After another 15 minutes or so of walking in large circles over several city blocks, nowhere close to my bed and breakfast, they had come up to only 5 to 10 feet behind me, ensuring they were impossible to ignore. Beginning to panic, I decided to use a non-native language I knew the best, Italian. In addition to pretending I didn't understand English, ignoring the French and trying to stay calm, I began to speak back to them in Italian, saying phrases such as, "I am sorry, I don't speak French, I don't understand what you're saying, is there something I can help you with, are you lost, etc." I am fair-skinned with blonde hair and blue eyes, and they could probably tell that I almost certainly wasn't Italian because I am sure I subtly, unintentionally revealed myself as an American. But after 45 minutes of following me and being stonewalled by a language that they, luckily, didn't know, they got brazen and walked close enough to me to reach out and grab me. I was completely lost, but trying to walk with feigned confidence in where I was, as well as hiding my inner panic and acting more confused and concerned for them than terrified. If I turned down an unpopulated street or, worse, into an alley, I had no doubt that they would have moved to outright aggression. I didn't know what they wanted with me, but the persistence and attempts to get me talking made me think that it was nothing good. The sun was already setting, and I was nowhere near my band B, and trying to ask for help would reveal my charade of being an Italian who wasn't lost. I didn't know the city well enough to find the police station, and I felt my options running out. If I ran, at least one of the 6 would likely be able to catch me, and beginning to scream could result in having my mouth covered and finally getting grabbed. Towards the end of this nightmare, I began walking up and down the exact same major street, with restaurants and tourists everywhere. I didn't want to leave this very public street and was hoping the obvious repetition might catch the attention of someone who could help. Finally, after an hour of being tailed and stubbornly refusing to show my obvious fear and disorientation, they stopped abruptly and began to walk down another street. Did they decide I was too much trouble to continue to follow? Or were they now hiding 1 or 2 of them at different intervals and possible paths I would take back to where I had dinner? Shaking with anxiety and tension, I walked around in a nonsensical route back to my room for 45 minutes after they walked away before I finally went inside and began sobbing immediately at the front desk. I explained to the clerk what had been happening and asked if he thought I was finally safe. He was certain that I was indeed in danger during this whole ordeal and pretty sure I shook them off, but just in case, he locked the front doors and carried my bags to stay in the large room closest in earshot of the front desk, but out of view of the front door. If you're traveling alone, Please always be vigilant and aware of your surroundings. Listen to your instincts and assume a natural suspicion to anyone that gives you pause. Try to stay calm, no matter how increasingly panicked you get. Keep a level head and try to think of your next move and continuously assess your options. Most importantly, please don't let anyone following you see where you are sleeping that night. The Death Mask. I've always had a morbid curiosity. From true crime podcasts to documentaries to books and spending hours online looking up killers both infamous and obscure. In fact, when I was in the 5th grade, my parents had to come in and talk to the teacher when I told the class about the body farms the FBI uses to teach future agents to identify how long corpses have been dead. I devoured this kind of stuff and still do, but it wasn't until I met Matt, my roommate at college, that this hobby was taken up a notch. Like me, Matt was into the same things, only his parents were rich and gave him enough money so he could go on what he called death tours, where he could go see where murderers lived, where they worked, and even to the sites of their grisly murders. And since I was his friend and into the same things as he was, he would pay for my ticket and bring me along. The first place we went was where H.H. Holmes' murder castle once stood. Since it was no longer there, we both thought this was a bit of a letdown. A shame too, because he was my favorite serial killer. Lots of people look at me odd for claiming I have a favorite serial killer, or when I explain that I love true crime and all its gory details. It's not like I am dangerous or anything, I just want to know how someone could go ahead and actually kill someone. Everyone has thought about it, but to actually go ahead and do it is. Well, that's what I find fascinating. The summer break before our senior year, we decided to take off to Arizona to explore where Mateo Salazar hunted for nearly 20 years before he was caught and executed. When Matt suggested this destination, I didn't know who Mateo Salazar was, so Matt showed me his stats, all the people he killed, how long he was active, etc. His crimes were so gruesome that I was surprised that I had never heard of him. He would abduct people and give them strange tattoos before skinning them alive and then kill them. No one knows why he skinned people he forced tattoos on, but it's suspected that it was part of a strange and twisted religious ritual. Also, the exact number of people he murdered is a topic of contention, but is anywhere between 35 and 50. Shortly after he was caught, the area he hunted in became a ghost town. Not just because no one wants to live in a place where that many murders happened, but because it was so isolated that there were no jobs to keep people around. Since then, it became a sort of grim tourist attraction dedicated to the man who killed so many. When we got there, I expected to see a tour guide, but other than the dust being kicked up by the wind and the abandoned buildings, there was very little to see. I would have thought that there would have been at least someone in the gift shop, the former post office, but that too was empty. Most of the things in the small and dust-covered gift shop were knickknacks and not interesting to either Matt or me. However, there was one thing that caused a cold shiver to creep up my spine. Under a glass counter was Mateo Salazar's death mask, taken shortly after his execution. Beneath it were the last words he spoke, and when I read them they sounded more like a curse. "My work is not finished. It will never be finished. I'll be back." Matt wasn't bothered by this, but for some reason I can't articulate, I was. I had to leave, but instead of telling Matt the mask made me feel uneasy, he would have relentlessly teased me if I did. I told him I was going off to explore. Which was true. All over town, there were plaques. Some gave a brief history of a building and others were about the people who either lived or worked there. Most of them were either Salazar's victims or friends who were oblivious to the horrible things he did when he was alive. Like always, I took tons of pictures while Matt ran off to do his own thing. In hindsight, I wish I had followed him around. Maybe things would have been different if I had. After a few hours had passed, I realized that I hadn't seen him around for a long time. It wasn't like the town was large enough to get lost in. In an hour, I had been down every major road, and after 2 hours, I saw mostly everything the town had to offer. Yet, there was no sign of Matt or anyone else. I wondered if this was one of his tricks. It was like he was going to jump out and try to scare me or something. If you knew Matt, you would know that this wouldn't have been a surprise. However, if he was going to jump out and scare me, he was displaying an uncharacteristically amount of patience because I hadn't seen any sign of him since leaving the gift shop. I called out to Matt after seeing all I could in that ghost town, but there was no reply. It's hard to explain how it felt having an entire town to myself. The best word I can come up with is eerie, but that falls short. Thankfully, Matt didn't jump out to scare me, but the look on his face hinted that he did something he shouldn't have done, but I was too tired and cranky from walking all day to ask him about it. Driving back to the hotel, Matt asked me what I thought of the town, and I told him that I was sort of let down by it. I was hoping that there was more to see, at least a tour guide that could have told us what the internet couldn't. I assumed that Matt would have been disappointed with my opinion, but it didn't bother him. After a long moment, I turned to look at him and saw a smile that did little to hide some mischievous deed. I asked what he did, but instead of answering, he said he would rather show me when we get back to the hotel, and I knew I wasn't going to like what he would say. He opened up the backpack he had with him all day and showed me the death mask of Mateo Salazar he had stolen from the gift shop. With a smile, he said he was going to hang it up on the wall back at the dorm. Needless to say, I was upset about this, even more so when he said it was all right because he looked and there were no cameras. As if I was mad that he might get caught and not because he stole something. I was tired and didn't want to fight. It wasn't like it would have done either of us any favors if I did, so I decided to drink at the hotel bar for the remainder of the night. When we got back to the dorms, Matt stayed true to his word and hung up the death mask on the living room wall. There, it served as an interesting conversation piece when we had guests. It didn't take long before our guests claimed they were getting a weird feeling from it. When asked about it, they said it wasn't so much as the feeling of being watched, which was also the case, but more like it was radiating evil. At first, we considered this nonsense. No one had that feeling before we told them about its origins, so we chalked it up as the placebo effect. In truth though, sometimes it gave me the creeps. I too would get the feeling of someone watching me when I was alone. In the weeks that followed, I would be doing something for class, reading a book, or researching something online, and in the corner of my eye I could have sworn that its eyes were open. However, every time I looked, its eyes were shut. I told myself it was the trick of the light, my imagination, or that I should take it easy with the edibles. However, none of that explained how Matt's behavior changed. He started missing classes, he stayed out all night, and hardly spoke to me. I should have done something, but at the time, the only thing I could think of was talking to his parents. Sometimes, when he thought I was asleep in my room, I could hear Matt talking to himself. One night I spied on him and discovered that he was actually talking to the death mask. I needed a break from this and decided to go to a party. I didn't go with Matt, not because of how much he changed, but because parties were never his scene. so I was a little surprised to see him standing in the corner, looking at everyone at the party. The way he was looking at people wasn't like his usual self. It wasn't like he was trying to build up the nerve to talk to a girl that caught his eye. It reminded me of the way a reptile looked at something, cold and unfeeling eyes calculating to decide if it was worth the effort to go after. Coming up with an excuse not to return to the dorm room was a no-brainer. I needed a break from Matt, so that night I slept at my girlfriend's house. The next morning I was reluctant to return, but when I did I saw police cars in the parking lot and on the grass next to the doors. People were crying and holding each other. When I asked what happened, they told me my roommate killed a girl while I was gone. I refused to believe it, but then someone showed me a video on their phone of the police frog marching Matt out of the dorms as he was laughing. The police interviewed me and I cooperated to the best of my ability. They didn't ask about Mateo Salazar's death mask, so I never mentioned it. After a few hours of interrogation, I was free to go, but was warned not to leave town. The people in the dorms treated me like a leper and kept away from me. Not surprising, after all, it wasn't a secret that the two of us had the same interests, and it was only natural to assume that I was involved with the murders too. The details of Matt's crimes came out over the next few days, and to me, they sounded exactly like Mateo Salazar's. He abducted 3 people, 2 girls and a guy, and killed them. Rumor was he also gave them tattoos and skinned them. I couldn't help but think of Salazar's death mask. If I wasn't already freaked out by it, hearing the details of Matt's crimes was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I decided to get rid of it. However, before I could throw it in the trash, someone knocked on the door. When I answered it, I was surprised and confused to see 2 people who didn't look like they were police or FBI. Not only were they hairless, but they also had bright orange coveralls. After asking who they were and what they wanted, the shorter of the 2 answered in a monotone voice and said they just wanted the mask. I would have given it to them for free, but they pulled out a checkbook and asked me to name my price. When I said the number, I thought they would haggle me, but they didn't blink and wrote out the check. Surprised at this sudden windfall of money, I didn't say or do anything to stop them when they let themselves in and took the mask off the wall. They left without a word after taking the mask, and I watched them depart down the hallway. On the back of their coveralls was the same name on the check, the Catadesmos Museum. Huntress in the Crimson Night. The coachman drives up her driveway, halts the horses, and, all the while throwing her quizzical and suspicious looks, he knocks on her mansion's door. Not an instant later, Lady Adder's butler opens the door. "My lady," Jean-Luc says, "this is an ungodly hour." The butler is a tall and strong man who sports a thin mustache and a hairstyle that screams immaculate care for one's image. He glances at the sun coming up over London, a few wisps of sunlight striking her clean window panes. Lady Adder steps out of the carriage. The butler takes one good look at her subtly rough clothes, at the shawl she wears over her head. He adds at once, "I trust the auction went well, yes?" Ungodly hour is not enough to describe this tomfoolery, the coachman says. He is short and stout, rude, and speaks entirely too much. Never have I seen someone fetching a sculpture before the sun rises. I told you, man, the artists I buy from are very eccentric people, Lady Adder explains. They think it ill luck to sell works of art in broad daylight. The coachman says, not very convinced. I figure that makes sense. He walks to the back of the coach and lifts the rope holding a tarp. Underneath is another one of Adder's beautiful creations. Or rather, decreations. The ruddy man stares at it for a second and shudders. It gives me the willies. My lady has a very realistic taste, Jean-Luc says in that way of his that makes it impossible to think badly of him. Truly, you must see the artistic value it represents. The sculpture is the size of a tall adult and has the shape of one. The subject is holding his hands across his face as if shying away from a projectile, and in his face is a look of abject horror with a hint of perversion or even satisfaction. The coachman looks away. Yes, yes, sir. Looks very posh. Very modern, yes. Why don't you two carry it inside? You know? Make yourselves useful. Jean-Luc gives Adder a dead look while the coachman confusedly says, of course, right away. The two of them struggle to take the statue out of the coach, then struggle even harder to take it up the steps. If not for her propriety's sake, Adder would help. Even if she decides to ditch that aspect of society for today, she is wary of moving too much and exposing her clothes. There's blood in them. Blood can prove incriminating given that night's events. Though the butler is not breaking a single sweat, the coachman's face looks like a bottle of red ink about to sizzle and burst. The two men have to rest every dozen steps or so. Adder would like to sneer and make fun of the stoic Jean-Luc, but her thoughts are unable to float to better seas. They're stuck in that realm where every action of hers is analyzed and critiqued by her most severe selves. 5 women died because she wasn't smart enough. 5 dead because she wasn't quick enough. Not to mention the others, killed by idiocy, by mimicry. Sure, she stopped one killer, but it would be hell to find all the others who were following in the footsteps of a madman. Madam? Jean-Luc calls. The coachman is behind him, huffing. I'm sorry, Jean-Luc. I gather I've simply become tired. His eyes linger on her. I'll be sure to draw a bath as soon as the sculpture is in place. Thank you, Jean-Luc. Her butler and the coachman finally enter Adder's favorite place in the mansion, an incredibly long corridor that parts her garden in half, with 2 rows of sculptures on each side, the Hall of Stone. The coachman whistles. This is the bee's knees, my lady. I've sure never seen such a fine collection. It is, she replies, wearing her voice. She needs to sleep. She needs to rest. She needs to plan her next steps. Now, where shall we set this marvel? The coachman slaps the sculpture. Jean-Luc points at the distance. On the other end of the corridor, my good man. The coachman pales, but Jean-Luc produces a small cart out of a discreet closet. The coachman relaxes his shoulders so much he turns even rounder. Is it okay if I appreciate your collection until the statue's in place, my lady? He asks. Adder is deadly anxious to take off her shawl. Her snakes slither, eager to relax in the open air. They are as tired as she is. Nevertheless, she says, sure. You've worked well tonight. You may appreciate this treat for the artistic soul. The Hall of Stone is organized by epochs. Near the entrance, all the statues sport either armor, togas, or rags. The clothes turn increasingly more European until, minutes worth of walking later, they become Victorian and fashions very much of the present day. The coachman gets increasingly uneasy with each sculpture. All of them hold expressions of terror, fear, or outright vileness, if that term can be applied to regular humans. Very garish but very artistic, yes, he says. They look very lifelike. You must have an eye for finding true talent in sculptors, though I do reckon that true appreciation of these pieces is better left for men with a better sense of art than mine, my lady. Nonsense, Adder tells him. We can all appreciate the worst moments of humanity. That's what my collection holds. I don't mean to be rude, my lady, but shouldn't art be more aesthetic? Who said anything about art, my good man? Adder stops at an empty spot. She motions Jean-Luc to put the sculpture there. He and the coachman do so. I can say this is a rather interesting model, madam, Jean-Luc says. May I ask who the model was? The coachman says. Adder takes a moment to study her creation. She answers, the most famous nobody you will ever set your eyes upon. As soon as the coachman leaves and Jean-Luc tips him nicely for his trouble, the butler draws Adder a nice bath. The light of the morning's first hours throws the water into a pleasing yellow-orange tone. Finally, she takes off her shawl and her blue-tinted glasses and eases into the water. Her wounds bristle against the warmth, though the beautiful snakes she has for hair bask in it, diving their small heads into the water, scooping it up, letting it fall, like toddlers playing. Jean-Luc stands by the window. He is fully aware of her true essence. A monster, for some. A gorgon, for others. For Jean-Luc, she is simply his Lady Adder, the one who saved him as a child. May I inspect your wounds, now, madam? You may. She sits up straighter in the tub and closes her eyes. It's a shame, she will never be able to look into the eyes of those she trusts without killing them. She hears Jean-Luc coming over and walking around her. You're breathing fine? I am. Raise your arms. How do your ribs feel? She was punched there. Hurt and numb. A lot? Moderately. Jean-Luc leans in closer and touches the snakes on her head. One of your darlings is a little odd. Were you hit in the head? I was, twice. Adder had had some of her darling snakes die on her in the past, and it was like losing a lifelong friend to the whims of fate. Jean-Luc disappears to the kitchen to fetch some of the wisps of rat meat he keeps at hand. He comes back and feeds the snakes, one by one, giving special attention to the one who took the brunt of the hit. So you caught him, madam? I did. Did he get anyone else? She quiets. Then, he did. A girl named Mary Jane. Mary Jane Kelly. Poor gal, Jean-Luc says. He is trying to comfort her in the only way he knows how. At least no one else will follow. You did good, madam. Adder snorts at this and sinks into the bathwater. Vincent killed 5 women. 5. But more were murdered because his crimes were sensationalized, and there were monsters dumb enough to follow his example. More will die. I don't plan on making him more famous than he already is. I want his true name to never come up in a history book. I want him forgotten. Vincent, Jean-Luc tries the name in his mouth. That's his name? It is. Vincent Tompkins. An accountant. He was a normal man. How was I supposed to find him? He lived near Whitechapel with a family that seemed healthy. He had a wife and a daughter and was well liked by friends and acquaintances. It took me weeks to even put him on my list of suspects. Goodness, Jean-Luc, these people lived with a monster without ever knowing. Jean-Luc starts rubbing her back. By Jove, she is sore. He was a pretender. No, pretender doesn't cut it. Calling him a monster doesn't cut it. He was a demon, a jinn, a vulture. You usually aren't hurt this badly. What happened? Before replying to that, Ada tells Jean-Luc that she wants to open her eyes. Promptly, he walks back to the window overlooking their garden. You can open them now, madam. So she opens her eyes. He sensed something wrong in me. She utters a dry laugh. A monster, recognizing another in the wild. You're no monster, madam. I'm no human either. Such dualities are prevalent in our society, but not in better minds. You may not be human, but that doesn't mean you are not humane. I repeat, you are no monster. Anyway, he recognized me and sensed some kind of danger when I approached. Jean-Luc refused to look into my eyes. He knew there was something wrong with them. At first, he ran. So I followed. As I got too close, he attacked me. You were armed. You should have defended yourself, Jean-Luc says, but he knows why she didn't. She hates maiming her creations. She wants them to be saved as they truly are, as they truly were. She wants to forever savor that last look of fear, or, in some cases, that of acceptance. She looks beyond Jean-Luc, beyond the garden, at the rising sun. A couple of birds pass through, blocking the sun for ephemeral moments. Would it do any good? Her actions, will they change anything? She kept hundreds of men she'd petrified in an attempt to remove their ill presence from this world, all but a small sample of the thousands she'd turned to stone in antiquity. Despite her best efforts, there are still wars, there are still horrible crimes, there are still corrupt politicians. There still is too much evil. As if reading her thoughts, Jean-Luc says, at least you've caught him now. He won't kill anyone else now. But he did. 5 women. Having turned Vincent to stone will never bring them back. Ada had some routines in place. There were particularly bad streets in London, bad neighborhoods where crime was of particular regularity. Coppers always opted to circumvent those places. It was easier to ignore the worst slums than it was to protect the innocents living in them. Enter Lady Ada. Using a discreet shawl and a regular outfit made of a brown skirt and a gray undershirt, she patrolled the worst places of London. One of these places was Flower and Dean Street and the entire East End region. Ada had caught a good handful of men who abused their authority and had turned them to stone, 5 of whom she'd sold for a hefty price as sculptures in the last year. She'd struck a casual sort of friendship with many of the prostitutes there, as well as with the women who simply stumbled on some bad times. That was how she'd first come to know Mary and Nichols. Nichols was a happy gal with a bad turn for alcohol and terrible luck in life. She had had a terrible husband in her youth, a terrible job, a terrible everything. Ada was eager for the day in which she'd patrol Flower and Dean Street or Thrall Street and Nichols would not be there, but far away, in search of a better life. Instead, on August 31st, Ada read of Nichols' death in the newspaper. Sliced throat. Mutilated. Repeatedly stabbed. This woman was a drunkard but was not hated by anyone. If anything, those who knew her pitied her. Ada's experience told her the murderer had not acted in haste or anger, but out of twistedness. London Metropolitan Police set Frederick Aberline on the case after rumors of this being a serial killer emerged. But Ada knew better. While the previous murders in the city were most probably related to gang violence, Nichols felt special. It felt like it was the start of something. Ada prowled like a hound during that first week of September. There was a lot of talk concerning Nichols. Some called her murder justified because she was unmarried, because she was a drunk. Her snakes went feral whenever a comment like this was passed around. The list of Adder's suspects grew, little by little. By the end of the following week, she had the names of 8 men and 3 women on her list of potential killers. Then, on the morning of the 8th of September, Adder woke up after a late night to panic on the East End. The body of a prostitute Adder had encountered but never spoken to, Annie Chapman, was found early in the morning. Through the morning paper and by spying in the right places, Adder pieced together the crime scene. Her coat was cut, left to right, disemboweled, intestines removed, set over her shoulders. Despite not hearing it anywhere, Adder thought it likely the killer had taken an organ. If he ripped open Annie Chapman's intestines, then it was likely he had taken a trophy. Chapman's pills, a comb, a piece of torn envelope, and a frayed muslin were some of the random objects found at the crime scene. A leather apron was also left in a dish of water. The killer, Adder was sure, left the items there only to confuse the detectives and the public. Every part of the crime scene was deliberate. Each item could be traced to a different clue, leading to a different kind of suspect. The killer knew he wouldn't get caught. He'd never revealed his identity. He was making fun of everyone who thought he'd be found out one day. Whoever he was in it for the long run. Adder went after each and every one of her suspects, but none behaved in any way that would hint at them as the murderers. Only a local bootmaker raised her suspicions, a man named John Pizer, who often publicly pestered women known to be prostitutes. Adder believed he had previously attacked some, but until she had solid proof, she wouldn't turn him to stone. He came to be known as Leather Apron after he was taken in as a suspect by the coppers. Adder didn't believe the man would be capable of the crimes. He was a coward. Too obviously a coward. Londoners were in a panic, and newspapers only exacerbated that panic. Media was a cancer that ended up costing some people their lives. Jean-Luc notified Adder a few days later of a couple of murders in the southern part of town. People were sending letters to newspapers pretending to be the killer, some going so far as to actually kill. It got crazy fast. People broke into the police station on Commercial Road on the grounds that the coppers already knew who the killer was and were keeping him there. Rewards were offered for the head of the killer. Even a committee was founded by locals of Whitechapel. Adder herself barely slept. Her list of suspects grew every night. She'd spy over brothels, over restaurants, over alleys, over everything. Her nights were spent in blind protection of the people of Whitechapel. It got to the point where she had to bring Jean-Luc with her to make sure she stayed alert. 1 week passed. Then another. Jean-Luc and Elle labored over every letter that was sent to the papers, over every postcard that was possibly sent by the murderer. During the final week of September, Adder began to cut off suspects from her list until she was down to 5. 5 men whom she'd crossed, more than once, roaming about in the night. It was on the 30th that her hard work paid off. Lady Adder is in her bathrobe, petting her snakes, studying the sculpture of Vincent Tompkins. There's a spot of a rough texture on his shirt. Blood. Mary Jane Kelly's blood. Looking at it, Adder could hear the spurting sounds of her innards as Vincent took her apart. That visceral stench, the taste of iron permeating the very air she had breathed just hours before, the red tinging the clothes she'd been wearing, the wetness of the blood clinging to her skin. At least she'd gotten to see horror on that monster's face. Vincent had gotten to see the inner part of her that not even Jean-Luc nor Perseus had seen. Her true essence. Her true appearance. She needed to become a monster to take down another. She was a monster, wasn't she? Madam. A reassuring hand falls on her shoulder. She immediately puts the sunglasses on and looks at Jean-Luc. You are not like him, he says. I know. What will you do now, madam? I'll rest today. This man put London in chaos, and part of that tired me by itself. I'll still have fires to put out in the next couple of weeks. There'll be copycats sprouting all over London. You can't take them all by yourself, madam. No, I cannot. But I can certainly try. You should rest, madam. So should you, Jean. She tries to give him a sympathetic look, resulting in a mere sad smile. She turns around to leave. You've been up all night. So have you. Madam? Where are you going? To get dressed, she replies. To go where? She stops and glances one last time at Vincent Tompkins, the Whitechapel murderer, cast in stone. To see her body. I want to make sure she was found. I don't want to leave her like that. Jean-Luc relents and says, I understand, madam. I'm going with you. Adder was following one of her suspects, William Clarkson, a high-grade wigmaker who had both royalty and previous criminals on his list of clients. Adder was blind with exhaustion, half stumbling at times. William had a liking for late-night strolls, as did every one of her suspects. She was passing near Duke's place when a scream rang in the dead of night. William kept on walking as if nothing had happened, but Adder ditched him at once and sprinted towards the origin of the noise. The scream couldn't have been that loud, since she had a sense of hearing far better than any human. Whatever happened, a woman had been killed, for Adder heard no other signs of struggle. She ended up entering Mitre Square and immediately spotted a large figure in a corner shadowed by moonlight. The figure was hunched over a corpse. Cutting. Slashing. Adder was too late. But not too late to catch him. The moment she took a step forward, the killer went still. How the hell had he felt her? He looked up and saw Adder. He thrust a hand into the corpse's stomach twice, both times taking an organ and wrapping it in cloth, then got up to escape. You, she yelled and went after him. Yet, he had disappeared. No! Steps. Steps, far away. He'd turned a corner. Blinded by rage, Adder ran, almost catching up to the man, to the killer, to that monster. He veered into a large street, empty save for him, Adder, and a confused woman. The killer was running straight in her direction. The knife in his hand glimmered against the moonlight. Run away! Adder yelled at the woman. The woman screamed and took a stumbling step back, her back meeting a wall. Run, she screamed again, but the killer ran past the woman, left hand but a blur, the knife slicing her throat. Blood spurted out the woman's neck. She put a hand to it, saw it coming away slick and red, and fainted. The killer escaped because Adder stopped by the woman, holding the wound in her neck as if her useless hands could stop life from leaving her. The wound was too wide. This woman was dead. Unless Adder turned her to stone. She'd still be dead, but some part of the woman would be eternal. Adder always wanted a sculpture that was beautiful, not the result of punishment, but of mercy. However, Adder heard steps approaching. The woman tried to open her eyes, convulsed, then went still. It was too late now. Defeated, Adder climbed rooftops in search of the man who'd done this, her clothes wet with the blood of an innocent. But there was no one on the street save for those now finding the bodies of the two women. The next day, Ada learned their names, Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride. Ada didn't know Stride, but she had talked to Eddowes before. She was just a regular woman. A regular human. Nothing living deserved such horrible deaths. From hell. Ada knew it hadn't been the killer to write that letter. She'd been before him. The killer was not a man to be recognized. He didn't want the acclaim, the attention, for himself, but for his work. His focus was on the murders, on showing others it could be done. In his own mind, he was an artist, the murders his canvas, his subjects. But that he was from hell, he was. Just like Ada was. Monsters from places are better left untouched by humanity. Still, Ada did not know who the killer was. She had removed all those who didn't match the killer's body shape from her suspect list and added some others who did. The result was 6 men. All through October, she worked hard to discover which one of them was the killer, to no avail. Every single night was spent making rounds throughout London, checking on each suspect. Every single night, she was disappointed. In her wanderings, she turned 2 men into stone. One was abusing his wife, whilst another was a young boy. Jean-Luc sold both sculptures. Ada couldn't keep every single wrongdoer her snakes caught. She only kept the most vile ones in the Hall of Stone, to remind herself of what the race that had killed her sisters was capable of. On the 1st of November, Francis Tumblety, one of her main suspects and a con man, went for a night stroll. He repeated it on the 2nd. On the 3rd day of the month, Vincent Tompkins, an accountant who worked by the docks, also left his home. Neither carried weapons, nor cloaks, nor anything that could be considered suspicious. She divided her next nights between following one and the other and memorizing the paths they liked to take. It was tiring work, but worth it, for on Friday the 9th, she first went to check on Francis. He did his usual round. Ada ran for 20 minutes until she found Vincent, only to see he was in none of his usual paths. And he had certainly not gone back home. The moon had a red sheen to it that night, making Ada see blood in every corner she glanced at. It was a crimson night. Something was wrong with the very feel of the air, with the very fabric of reality. Vincent was carrying no weapon visibly. He could very well be hiding an arsenal of blades underneath his suit. Ada searched and searched, ears always open for screams. She heard none. In the end, what brought her to the murderer was nothing but dumb luck. Passing through what was, possibly, one of the worst slums in London, Dorset Street in Spitalfields, Ada caught sight of a room illuminated by a fireplace. Though it was night as of yet, the sun would rise short of an hour hence, so the city was at its quietest. Except that room with a burning fire. Slowly, Ada made her way there, careful not to be heard, noticed, or even felt by that man. The door to this room was unlocked. From behind Ada came the crimson shine of the moon, as if a vengeful god was watching her every move. From the fringes of the door came the mellow glow of the fire. The killer would have nowhere to go. He'd have to go through her. She had him trapped. With a nimble push, the door opened. The first thing that hit her was the stench of torn intestines and blood, like copper and spoiled water. The second thing was the sound. The killer had heard her, but he hadn't stopped what he'd been doing. The third was the shape of the woman. Despite the mutilations on her face, Ada knew her. She'd seen her around Flower and Dean Street. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly, and she was a pretty girl, kind, and funny. She didn't deserve this. Kelly's stomach was torn open. The contents of her insides were strewn around the room. Her legs were butchered. Ada could see their bone. The killer was cutting Kelly's breasts off. He finished cutting one, held it, steadied it against the light of the fire, then threw it on the floor. It fell with a meaty, wet thump. He got started on cutting the other. Vincent Tompkins was blonde, wore a full, respectable beard, and he was grinning, showing perfect teeth. "You finally caught me, eh?" he said. His voice was low, guttural. "Why," was all she managed to say. "Did you bring a gun? Will you kill me now? Do you have any weapons?" He kept his eyes on his hands, on his blade. "Look at me," Ada said. He chuckled. "I don't think I will." She took off her shawl and her glasses. "Look at me." She stepped forward and closed the door. He collectedly finished cutting the breast off. He grabbed it, held it, and threw it in front of the fireplace, which had clothes fueling the fire. Vincent glanced at her through a mirror in Kelly's room. "I thought so. Not human, eh? What do they call you? Medusa, innit? Leave my sister's name out of your forsaken mouth. Look at me." He got up and wiped the blood from his blade with his gloves. Suddenly, he charged at her, shoulder first, hard, against her ribs, throwing her back, and breaking the door's hinges open. He ran. Ada, however, had been ready for it. Cornered prey acted desperate, and her body wasn't as frail as a human's. Sure, she'd be bruised, but she could still move. She was on her feet in an instant. She sprinted, but Vincent was waiting around the corner. He punched her in the head. She fell. He kicked her in the head twice. He kicked her in the stomach before she had an instant to gather her thoughts. He was about to stomp her skull when she caught his boot. "You hurt one of my snakes. You damning monster. You and her and all of them are just the same. I am going to purify this world. I am going to." Ada held his leg so hard it cut blood flow and shut him up. "Monster? Don't make me laugh, you little man." Ada rose to her feet. Vincent closed his fist to punch her, but Ada grabbed his chin and threw his head against the wall. She permitted the snakes in her head to come apart, diving her body in half, like her garden, her skin coming undone to reveal her truth. What are you?" "You don't deserve to know," she said. "But if you open your eyes, you will see what you could have one day become, a true monster." At once, he did. Horror threatened to overwhelm his life before his heart could turn to stone. Hatchet-wielding psychopath. It was quite a beautiful night when all of this happened. I had been working at a hostel in Arkansas, and I had met a German national named Emilia. We became a thing rather quickly and spent our nights searching and exploring the city streets and enjoying the lamplights in their orange glow, laughing and joking and kissing and hugging, all that sort of stuff. It was in October, a few nights before Halloween, and we were on one of our typical nightly escapades. I remember that the moon was bright. I cannot quite recall if it was full or not, but I know that it was light enough to witness all of our surroundings. There was this spot called Foster Pond and I frequented a specific bench that seemed to never be occupied. Almost as if it were only for us. Her and I sat there, gazing up towards the stars, listening to the trickles of pond water, enjoying the strange scenery of the town around us. We felt untouched and unburdened. She and I made plans to visit Germany next year and celebrate Oktoberfest together. It was an innocent time, really. After a while, Emilia leaned her head back more and more and stared up towards the constellations, and I fixated my eyes out towards the pond and the area that enveloped it. At first it was just movement. Motion. A lone figure walking down the path. Not unusual at midnight in this particular part of town. However, something grabbed at me and my slim to nothing attention span about this particular wayward walker. The walk was deliberate, methodical, angry, and fast. The first impression I had was that this dude really had something going on. Perhaps it was a Halloween party, or perhaps he had just been relieved from work and just wanted to get home. Something about the gate really got my attention, and I could not stop fixating on this man just charging through the park in a Mattacheri sort of way. Within a few seconds it sprung on me why I was so fixated on the guy. It was what he had in his right hand. It was a hatchet. Definitely a hatchet. Now, my first thought was, cool. Halloween costume. Hatchet-wielding psycho. Well done, sir, well done. But another few seconds passed by and I thought to myself, maybe not. Upon further inspection it appeared as if he wasn't really in a costume, and it did not seem to be a mere prop. To be clad in nothing but shorts and a hoodie whilst wielding a hatchet would not be inappropriate for Halloween. I had to remind myself it wasn't quite Halloween yet. In fact, it was 2 days until Halloween. This was no costume, and that hatchet was no mere prop. It dawned on me in the dark that this was straight up a dude walking across the park with a hatchet and coming straight at Emilia and me. At the moment, I wasn't quite sure as to what to do, but I figured it would be best to do something like get the hell out of there. I turned to Emilia and whispered, "Hey, don't worry about it, and please don't ask any questions yet, but just get up and let's go. Let's go back to the hostel. Nowish." Okay, she said. Fortunately for me, she didn't ask any questions or present any disagreements. She stood up off the bench and I put my arm around hers and we walked back towards the hostel while I said, "Nothing's wrong. Keep it cool." I wanted her and I to walk as if we had not had a care in the world, as if nothing was wrong. Okay, she repeated over and over as I felt myself nervously picking up the pace while trying to seem chill and nonplussed. We got to the door of the hostel and I opened the door and made sure she went in first and I followed and then locked the door behind me. Tight. I peered out into the darkness out by the pond. "What is it?" Emilia asked. She knew something was up by now. "What's wrong?" Feeling safer behind locked doors, I felt a responsibility to inform her of the situation, but I did not want to freak her out. For all I knew, I was the only person who was freaked out. But, still. "There's some guy out there with an axe," I said. What?" Emilia asked. "Just look," I said. "Just wait." Sure enough, the man with the hatchet came right up to the bench where Emilia and I had been sitting. He looked left. He looked right. Up. Down. Past him, behind, in front. All over. He even looked down on the ground and scoured the place. Then, this figure emitted the most terrifying scream I had ever witnessed escape a human body before. It was filled with torment and anguish and frustration. Behind closed, locked doors, the scream was loud enough to give me goose pimples. "The hell?" Emilia asked. After shaking his arms at the stars and sky as if the gods had wronged him, The figure with the hatchet sunk his hooded head down low and began to walk off back towards whence he came. We were safe, presumably. After reading the newspapers and talking to a few neighbors the day after, no information came. Nobody had known anything about this strange solitary figure who paraded Foster Pond with a hatchet. I pray it was an isolated incident. Amelia and I never went to that pond after dark ever again.